My name is Shannon, and this is my first book, Our Minds on Freedom, and it's just recently been re released in paperback, which I'm grateful for. I think I wanted it in paperback originally. And so it's been 10 years. So I had to actually, I don't know if my author friends have had to do this as well, go back and reread my own book because I hadn't looked at it for so long. And so it's actually very timely considering what's happening right now. And disturbing. And I had forgotten much of the information that was in there, particularly with regards to the amount of violence that some of the women endured uh, while they participated in civil rights activities and protests, not only in like rural areas. The last chapter is about Faraday and Jonesboro um, uh, and people outside, and but also in New Orleans. And so I was just reminded that um, during the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter didn't really matter then either. And I think I put marked a couple pages where I could read some of the police brutality that happened to some of these women. But I thought what I would do is here I'm scrolling to make sure. Hi, Dorothy. And of course, my neighbors could not shut up for a second. I was going to read because the McDonough Day boycott, because the statue of John McDonough in New Orleans was just torn down. And for those of you who don't know, I'm gonna read the passage that I wrote about the McDonough Day boycott. But John McDonough was a slaveholder, and I was talking with a friend last night. This particular removal is probably a little bit controversial because John McDonough was considered by many to be kind of a benevolent slaveholder. And when he died, he was not only buried alongside his slaves, people that he had owned, of course, but he left his fortune to build schools in New Orleans and Baltimore for all children, regardless of class or caste or color. And so I was there. There hasn't been a lot said, and I was researching yesterday about his statue coming down. Although the latest I heard is they had thrown it in the Mississippi River and divers recovered it and it's in a secure location and perhaps will be put in a museum, which is, if anybody's wondering, that's kind of where I'm at. With what we should do with some of these monuments. Hi, Jen. So I'm just going to read about the McDonough Day boycott. And if you have any questions after that, LB can give them to me and I can see them on here as well. So this is what the boycott was about in 1954, and it happened 10 days before the United States Supreme Court ruled in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So it was very timely. At the end of every school year, thousands of Orleans Parish school children participated in the historic Founders Day ceremony. For years, the city honored John McDonough, a white slaveholder who bequeathed most of his fortune for the purpose of educating both sexes of all classes and castes of color. For African American children, the McDonough Day Parade was more than simply paying respect to the individual who had helped fund their education. It paid homage to a man who was hated and abused by white New Orleanians for the charitable way he treated the African Americans who, and I quote, worked for him. Throughout his lifetime, McDonough emancipated many of his slaves, and upon his death in 1850, he freed the remainder and requested that his ashes be placed in the Negro Cemetery among his beloved friends. For Black New Orleanians, the McDonough Day Parade was their chance to honor a rare breed of white antebellum Southerner. In 1954, the New Orleans African American community challenged the way the parade had for years been organized. In February, four African American women, Ethel Young, president of the PTA Council of New Orleans, Emily Davis Thomas, principal of McDonough 24 and representative of the Orleans Parish Principals Association, Veronica Hill, president of the League of Classroom Teachers and national vice president of the American Federation of Teachers, and Mrs. E. Belfield Spriggins, a teacher at McDonough 35. They met with the Orleans Parish School Board. They presented a letter to the superintendent of the Orleans Parish School System, which protested the, and I quote, discriminatory practices in carrying out the McDonough Day Parade. Since the parade's inception, White school children had assembled first and marched in a processional, laying flowers beneath John McDonough's monument in Lafayette Square. Black school children were forced to stand, sometimes in sweltering humidity and unbearable heat, waiting their turn until all of the white children paraded by the monument. The women expressed their dismay that by the time the African American school children passed McDonough's monument, the noted dignitaries in attendance and most of the, and I quote, interested spectators had already left. In addition, they cited the extra hardship on colored children due to the lack of toilet facilities for their group. And I'm quoting the letter. For those of our children who understand the significance of this parade, it is a most humiliating experience. For the rest, the parade only serves to condition them before they are old enough to think to second-class citizenship. On behalf of Black Louisiana parents and their children, Young, Thomas, Hill, and Spriggins requested an end to the decades-old discrimination against Black Louisiana children so that McDonough Day Parade could stand at last as a symbol of true American democracy, unquote. In response to the request that each school parade in alphabetical order according to school district, the Orleans Parish School Board cited Louisiana's segregation laws, adding that it was forced to, and I quote, go along with the admonition of the police superintendent not to alter the parade's format. Dr. Clarence Sheps, president of the school board, further noted, and I quote, we live in a community in which segregation is the law, and we would not be doing our duty if we did not abide by the law. We operate under the law and will continue. It cannot be done or it will not be done. In early May, a number of Black civic, educational, and religious associations, including the New Orleans branch of the NAACP, the Louisiana State Conference for Labor Education, and the Teamsters Local 965, called for a boycott of the McDonough Day ceremonies. The NAACP asked all local school principals not to, and I quote, impede or rouse parents who refuse to permit their children to become a part of any mass demonstration fostering second-class citizenship. It would, they added, be better to keep the children home rather than see them participate in such an open display of segregation. Local civil rights leaders appeared on local radio stations and sent more than 10,000 letters to parents urging them to keep their children home that school day. On Friday, May 7th, 1954, thousands of Black school children stayed home during the McDonough Day ceremonies. Citing only, and I quote, token Negro participation, the local Black newspaper called the protest the most unified action ever undertaken by local Negroes. Among the many witnesses to the mass demonstration were a number of middle-class Black women, including original petitioner Ethel Young, Fannie C. Williams, civil rights activist and the retiring principal of the all-Black Valina C. Jones High School, and Miss Simon Marine, president of the PTA at Jones High School. Williams stated that she had been attending these ceremonies for some time, and since this was the last year before she retired, she did not, as an American citizen, want to miss this opportunity. School board president Clarence Sheps expressed his regret that, and I quote, all Negro children did not participate in the ceremonies because it means a great deal to them. Ethel Young countered that, and I quote, the parents have spoken and gone on record as not approving of the second-class citizenship demonstration accorded their children at the biased McDonough Day ceremonies. Marine added that she was, and I quote, not discouraged. I worked hard for them not to go, and I am greatly disappointed that even 4 children from my school had to go. The following year, another mass boycott was called. Not one African American child attended the ceremony. On May 17, 1954, 10 days after the McDonough Day boycott, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that separate was inherently unequal. Following this decision, many Southerners embraced massive resistance, paralleling a reactionary anti-communist campaign fomented by Senator Joseph McCarthy. The McDonough Day boycott is merely one example of the ways in which Louisiana women, within a climate of potentially dangerous right-wing extremism, sought to create a more just and democratic society. By refusing to allow their children to participate in the McDonough Day ceremonies, they taught their children in the Orleans Parish school system a lesson in how to successfully challenge white supremacy. So I'm going to stop there, at least with that passage, and I can take questions, I guess. Hi, Charles and Ronnie, from anybody. If you have any questions about that or about what's happening with the monuments what I know about what's happening with the monuments across the country, notably, what they're doing with the McDonough Day. It's just his head basically that was on a pedestal, and they have it in hiding. I guess it's in some secret location right now, which is really interesting. So I don't know if anybody has any questions for me, and LB is going to send me questions, I guess. There are no questions. I can't see if people are typing. So I also had bookmarked in the book a couple of places where I was struck by, when you reread your research. And the book is much shorter than my dissertation actually was. We tried to keep it small. But some of the police brutality that I was reading about from the 1960s is reminiscent. It was reminding me of what's happening at these Black Lives Matter protests. Um, and so it's you know history is really never past, right? Tom, did the women have the potential decision in Brown on the radar? I don't know that they did, but I do know there was nothing I remember in the document stating that they knew that this case was at SCOTUS level. Oh, the video is about 10 seconds behind. Okay. Um, I do know. So Louisiana teachers were some of the first in the country to petition for equal pay and to file court cases at the local level, the state level, um, the district level, and then all the way up to the Supreme Court. And some of the cases that the women brought date back to the 1930s. And so I do know that these women, at one point when they were trying to integrate um, the New Orleans schools in 1960, and there was all this, they had delayed opening the school system and all of that. Veronica Hill, who I mentioned, and some other of the women were not allowed to enter the school board meeting. And so, one of the greatest, I think, one of my favorite passages in my book is how they climbed up the fire escape on the side of the building and like slipped the petition under the door and actually were heard. So, they had been active for decades doing this kind of work and going through the courts and working with the NAACP. So maybe some of them knew. I think they were more concerned about the equitable treatment of their children. I hope that answers your question, Tommy. No, I think that they saw it as a protest. I mean, I also think that it was a way to get their children, like you said, out of this racist event. True. But I also think it was part of the larger movement that was happening in New Orleans um, in the 1950s. Because my book starts in 1924, and so Louisiana women and New Orleans in particular, had been organizing voter registration drives. They had organized a voters civic league in the 1930s. They had been active in the 1940s in all areas of education. And so it was what I think what my larger book does is argues that these women had been a part of the protests since the 1920s into the 1930s, 40s, and 1950s. But yeah, the it clearly was right. And so what's interesting is I was remembering doing the research that it was usually just unbearably hot, as New Orleans or Louisiana is in May, and these poor kids couldn't use the restroom and they had to stand in the sun, the black children to wait till all of the white children went. Well, the day of the boycott, because I'm always interested in looking at what the weather is historically speaking when some of these things are happening. The day of the boycott, the first boycott was unseasonably cool. Um, and it was only, I think, 70 degrees that day. And so, but they weren't there anyway. So I always think weather related is interesting as well. Other comment. I don't have any other comments, or I don't know. LB, do you see any other comments? Since I'm behind on the video. I wanted to read this one if people are while people are thinking. This passage that struck me about. So I was one of the things that I had talked to the press about talking about was armed resistance, and one of the ways that we've um, altered the narrative of the civil rights movement in the last 20 years is to dispel the myth that this was like a nonviolent, beloved community protest, Martin Luther King, peaceful, nonviolent, Gandhian ways, right? And certainly, my last chapter talks about how Louisiana activists were armed, particularly in places like Faraday, Jonesboro, where they organized the Deacons for Defense and Justice, which started in Bogalusa, Louisiana, in response to an attack on three black women that were walking from church, and they had acid thrown on them. And so when I was writing this last chapter about these women carried guns, and this is part of when the movement began to fracture because the larger organizations like the Congress of Racial Equality or CORE, the NAACP, were telling their members they didn't want them carrying weapons, but these people's lives were in danger, particularly in the rural areas of the state. So here's one of the here's a report on attacks on women in Bogalusa who were protesting, picketing, and this is in 1965. So this is after the Civil Rights Act is passed, before the Voting Rights Act is signed into law. White women hitting Patricia Smith, who was a civil rights activist, in the stomach while she picketed. Police often harassed Hattie Mae Hill. She was a young member of the Congress of Racial Equality. While she was picketing in front of the department store one afternoon, police referred to her as the N-word, bitch, and trash. 10-year-old Ann Ruth Hutchinson and her 12-year-old sister Brenda entered a local diner with their freedom hats on. The white waiter called them the N-word, pushed their food at them. And then when they left the restaurant, a white man followed them out. Mrs. Oralee Robinson reported to CORE that police arrested her for disturbing the peace when she intervened to stop a white man from beating Barbara Hicks, another local black female activist. Robinson reported to the National Congress of Racial Equality office that police pushed her and grabbed her around the neck and began to squeeze. When her son attempted to intervene, the policeman told her, "All you N-words are going to jail." In another case, a group of white men severely beat two local women when they attempted to test a bar and restaurant in Sun, Louisiana, approximately 3 miles from Bogalusa. After they were refused service, 8 or 9 men brandishing guns followed them down the road. So those are just some. I mean, that was 1965, and it's still happening. We're witnessing in real time. I Tommy, text me what you think about the statue's removal. I'm um I think all of the statues, particularly the Confederate ones, need to come down, and I think they need to be placed in a museum in their local communities where there can be some historical context. Like when you go into a museum and there's a little card next to it and it tells you what the painting is about or what the artist's intent was, or because a lot of these monuments don't have any context. And so you're just seeing a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest without talking about his participation in the Civil War and his involvement in murders. So it's sad that we're not, yes, Diana, it's sad we're not doing better now. In fact, it feels very much, in many ways, like the 1960s, for a variety of reasons, but mainly because we're witnessing this violence and this violence on behalf of police against protesters, black and white, actually. But I don't know, Tommy, if you can hear me. What do you think about these statues being removed. And also, I want to note that the founder of the Black Lives Matter movement is a Black woman. Um, and so, certainly what my book argues is the significance of women to the protests in Louisiana for decades, and not just because we, for so long, it was about Martin Luther King and the ministers and Malcolm X, but really what the men and women that I talked to and interviewed when I was doing my research said, and a lot of the men too, including one of my advisors, Raphael Casimir, who was the president of the NAACP Youth Council, and then was a member of CORE, and then became president of the Louisiana NAACP. He said really the heart of the movement, the grassroots of the movement was what were the women. So I'm reading Tom. I'm totally okay with statues coming down, but I get squirrely about it for two reasons. It's a slippery slope to knocking down the Washington Monument, which I guess would be okay. And then two, it seems like a red herring to real systemic change, which will make white people feel good about themselves without doing anything meaningful. I agree. And I agree with you, Diane, that we shouldn't force people to look at these statues, particularly in communities like New Orleans, where a majority minority population or demographic exists, and then they're having to confront their real history on a regular basis, and feeling second class in their own community because we're honoring these individuals, right? Like Lee Circle and all of that. And so we need to do a reassessment of how we're doing history and who we're honoring. And that includes, I agree, Christopher Columbus. And also, so I'll say, so my good friend Karen Cox, and Tommy, I don't know if you know, I'm sure you do know this, is in real time writing a book on the Confederate monuments, and is working on, as of yesterday, was writing the last chapter, and then we'll, I'm sure, have to update and do an epilogue and all of that. I've been talking to her weekly about it, and apparently it's on fire, as Francois Hamlin said. So we'll have a good teaching tool, I think, soon, to help our students understand how this works, because they don't have monuments to Nazis in Germany, right? So associating these monuments to the Southern identity elevates them from what many really were to intimidate the activists. True. And as Karen has talked about in her book, and as the case in New Orleans, in her book about the Daughters of the Confederacy and Dixie's Daughters, and then Dreaming of Dixie, and then this book she's writing is, and as Tom knows, and the historians who are on here, when those monuments were erected, it coincided with kind of the nadir of race relations and the height of Jim Crow, right? So 1900 and 1920, we see a spike, and when they're pushing to change textbooks and honor these Confederate soldiers and generals and people. And then again in the 1950s and 1960s, certainly after the Brown decision, and then after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. So it was, there's timing to, there's a history to who we're honoring and why, right? So any other questions? I know we're only supposed to go to 3:30, but that's fine. I'm happy for all of you who logged on, and wish I could see your faces. And I guess we'll have to schedule a Zoom meeting, Marilyn and Tommy and all y'all. LB, do you have anything else? Right. I'm going to answer Tom's question about if there's a historical monument or marker in Bogalusa to the 65 civil rights fight there, and if one went up, I wonder how long it would take to get bullet holes. What did I see yesterday on social media about who's great? Maybe it was it was a Black Panther maybe who was killed, and his son goes every years um, and sees uh, where the police shoot up his grave. Um, yeah, yeah. I haven't been to Bogalusa, Tommy. Have you? Maybe next year when we're in Alexandria for the big LHA meeting. Um, I don't know how. I'll have to look. I need to go anyways. Well, I guess I'll end the session and thank you all for coming. And clearly, if any of you, I mean, I think everybody has my cell phone number that's been on here. So if you have any questions, you can text me or slide into my direct messages on Facebook. Um, and thank you, LB and LSU Press and Rand, for setting this up and setting up this series. I think, um, and that's it. So I'll end the video. I'm reading the comments. All right, thanks everybody, and stay safe and enjoy the rest of the summer. Love y'all.